Hello friends, welcome to the EduSite Network. Our today's topic of discussion is diplomacy, and for this we have thus in our studio Dr. Aparajita Kashyap, Assistant Professor, University School of Law and Legal Studies, Guru Gobind Singh, Indraprastha University, New Delhi. Her area of specialization is international relations and politics, and she has been teaching for nearly a decade. With this brief introduction, I'd like to welcome ma'am to our EduSite studio. Welcome ma'am, and so much thank you for coming. And I request you to begin our today's lecture.
Yeah, thank you, Urvashi. Good afternoon, viewers. Today's lecture is dedicated to diplomacy, and I would be going by the traditional notions of diplomacy as per international relations. Now, if we look at our day-to-day life, every aspect of life involves some kind of diplomacy, but what we are going to do here is based on how states conduct their relations with each other. So, diplomacy here is strictly political and strictly with respect to international relations. So, if we go into the politics in the world, there are two kinds of situations. The situations are of conflict or cooperation, and conflict situations eventually end up in war, and if we have to avoid the war, there has to be some tact utilized, and that may ultimately lead to cooperation, and the tact or the strategy that is used to avoid war may become an important tool, and that is diplomacy. So today's lecture is dedicated to diplomacy. I would just like to take you back to a bit of the political history. With the Treaty of Westphalia, nation states emerged as important actors in world politics, and the interstate relations started becoming different and more complex, and this is when we had conflicts between states, or we had cooperation between states, and we needed some mechanism to guide the relationship between states. And the situation worsened, and as a result we had the First World War. At the end of the First World War, with the signing of Treaty of Versailles, it was decided that we needed an international organization that would not let another world war happen, and that is when the League of Nations was formed. The League of Nations was given a particular mandate, but it could not unfortunately fulfill the mandate that it was erected for, and its failure was evident in the ensuing of the Second World War. The Second World War and the First World War, they are only 10 years of political history if we count from 1648, but these are the 10 most defining years of international relations and international politics. And the Treaty of Westphalia to Treaty of Versailles to the end of Second World War, when then we had serious deliberations being carried out, and there's an irony here that the victors were making the move to contain any further war, and there were three major actors: Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin, and there were three important conferences. We had the Dumbarton Oak Conference, the Yalta Conference, and the San Francisco Conference, at the end of which the Atlantic Charter was signed, and it was decided that we needed a more effective international organization, and this international organization would try to do away with all the shortcomings that League of Nations was fraught with. And this is when we have in 1945 the emergence of United Nations, and United Nations Charter had certain ambitions or objectives, and one objective was to ensure international peace and security. And for ensuring international peace and security, certain criteria were laid down. Now, there were three stages of steps to be taken in case of a conflict. The first stage was, in case a country was found to be not behaving as it should behave internationally, the first stage was severing of economic, diplomatic ties, breaking off of communication means. These were the first stages. The second stage was we would take certain harsh measures like economic sanctions, trade blockades, and then if all these two methods, these two stages fail, then we would go in for the third step, which was use of actual forces of land, air or sea. But a very important chapter of the UN Charter is dedicated to alternative dispute resolution, and one aspect of alternative dispute resolution then became negotiation and mediation. These became very important tools in solving international conflicts and crises. And if we draw from this alternative dispute resolution mechanism, this brings us to the concept of diplomacy. So negotiation, mediation, they became tools in solving international conflicts. And negotiations, as we know, it's a direct and bilateral process in which the heads of the state or their accredited agents, they come and communicate. Whereas mediation involves, importantly, a third person. There is an intermediary who's involved, because these two sides cannot sit together, they cannot discuss together, so there we need somebody to bring them together, and that important role is played by the mediator. Now this mediator could be one person, it could be a community, it could be an international organization, it could be even a country. So mediation and negotiation, both of these alternative dispute resolution mechanisms need a kind of tact, and that tact that they need is called diplomacy. So having said all this, given a background, I would now directly come to the process of diplomacy. It is a method of establishing preconditions for permanent peace. The idea is that we want a long duration peace. And this process of negotiation is central to the working of the world politics. And the methods or the modes that are being adopted are not physical force, they are not weapons, but we are trying to resolve conflicts through dialogues and negotiations. Now, there are certain important facts about diplomacy, and that will bring us to the kind of diplomacy that we have. The application of intelligence and tact and the conduct of the officials who are interacting becomes an important feature of diplomacy. So these are independent governments. They assign certain people who conduct the official relations, and these people are chosen because they have certain competence, they have certain qualities of negotiating. The second important facet of diplomacy is that although we often confuse the terms diplomacy and foreign policy and we use them interchangeably, but we have to keep this in mind that foreign policy is a larger aspect, of which diplomacy is a tool which assists in attaining the objectives of foreign policy. And the third important facet about diplomacy is that foreign policy is oriented towards settling goals, and sometimes the goals are being settled, and in the process we are just mentioning the strategies and the tactics that we are going to use. So we can say that there is a goal, and for accomplishing that goal we are using a tool, and that tool or device is known as diplomacy. Going back to the history, diplomacy is not a new technique. If we look at the Indian history also, we have during the Vedic period we had emissaries being sent to other countries, and these would go and they would give the viewpoint of the rulers, or they would come back and narrate certain stories about the country of their visit, and this was an important breakthrough in conducting relations between two countries. Now, if you look into the actual existence of diplomatic document, it dates back to 2500 BC, and it was a letter which was inscribed on a tablet sent from Ebla on the Mediterranean coast. This is a place in Italy, to Hanzai in present day northern Iran. So from Italy to Iran we had a diplomatic document being sent. Then if we look at the classical Greek states, they had diplomatic systems and very modern diplomatic systems. In fact, we have borrowed some of the system from them. This diplomatic system was then revived in medieval Europe. And as we know that international relations, international politics, the breeding ground for all the developments was importantly Europe. But we cannot negate the Indian thinkers also, like Kautilya. He had foreign policy on his mind when he talks about Mandal theory. Then he talks about the espionage system. So he was very aware of the importance of diplomats, although he did not name them so. Now, if we go further, we see that diplomatic activities became important in the relations between city-states of Renaissance Italy and emerging states of post-Reformation Europe. And then the timeline, if we were to trace the timeline, the important landmark era is the Congress of Vienna of 1815. It regularized a system of permanent diplomacy between states, and this is when we started basically institutionalizing the diplomatic process. Going strictly by the process of diplomacy, we can come to a certain conclusion that if we have to define diplomacy, we can call it a communication process between international actors that whose aim is to resolve conflicts short of war. Now, if we look at this, we translate this activity in terms of foreign policy, then it is a means to an end. A means are the instruments that you adopt or the methods that you adopt to achieve a particular end, and it is the means are the policy instruments that we are using, and diplomacy becomes one instrument, and the end is the foreign policy objective that a nation delineates in its conduct of foreign relations. Now, Professor Hans P. Morgenthau, he outlined important tasks of diplomacy, and these are the major pointers to what a diplomat is expected to do and what the process of diplomacy is supposed to be handling. Now, according to him, there are 4 important determinants. First task is that it must determine its objective in background of power actually and potentially available. There could be a gap, mismatch between the power actually and potentially available, because potentially you may have a lot of power, but you may not be able to use all of that power. For example, we can talk about nuclear weapons. Some of the countries are doing clandestine nuclear programs. Now, the potential power is very high, but they cannot declare it because it's a secretive activity. So the actual power is less than the available power. So we have to see the balance that is there between the potential power and the actually available power. Second is, when we are talking about diplomacy, we are not talking about diplomacy in isolation or vacuum. Diplomacy vis-a-vis other countries, other actors. So the important objective is that we must measure our power with respect to the power of other nations. So we have to assess our power relative to the other nation with which we are having some problems or we are trying to cooperate. So this is important. The third important task is there are different objectives available, there are different methods that we can use to attain those objectives. So we have to look at the compatibility of each objective, whether this is compatible with the larger objective that we have. So you have to assess the compatibility of each of the objective. And the fourth important task of diplomacy is that only speaking or a lip service is not going to suffice. You have to employ effective means to attain the objective. So the objective that you have set out in the beginning, there has to be enough means to attain those objectives. And Professor Morgenthau goes on to say that failure of any of these, any of 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to jeopardize the entire process of diplomacy, and then the entire aim of solving conflicts would not be possible. Now, if we look at the instruments of diplomacy, how do we conduct diplomacy? There are two important instruments. One is the institution and the second are the personnel. So if we talk about the institution, we speak about the physical structure, the buildings of embassies or high commissions that are housed in another country, and most of them are located in the capitals. If it's a bigger country, we have more than one diplomatic mission. Then with regard to the personnel, these are the diplomatic staff of that particular country which are posted in the country with which they want to have some relations. So these countries are they post certain people for a particular period into the other country, and these personnel, they may be trained, they may be selected through certain specific examinations like the Indian Foreign Service in India. They may be certain people with certain expertise of international relations. So they could be academicians, they could be career diplomats. So the background of the diplomats varies from country to country and depends on how they take their diplomats. And if we look at these personnel, then buildings are important, but not so important as the people who are conducting the process. So if we look at the role of the diplomats, the personnel, the diplomats represent their home government. They communicate to their own government the views and interests of the country where they are posted. In negotiation, they try to reconcile the interest and views of the others. So they definitely are aware of the goal and objectives and views of their own government. They try and listen to the views and objectives of the other government with which they are negotiating, and then they will try and negotiate or reconcile or ask for certain concessions or give concessions when they are conducting relations. So if we look at the broad role that the diplomats are performing, there are certain fixed roles which they are doing. One is information gathering, second is policy advice, third is they are representing their own government, fourth is negotiation, and fifth is the consular services that they are giving, things like visa and extension of citizenship or OCI cards. So these are some of the supports that the home citizens abroad are being provided. So the consular service is also an important diplomatic activity. Now, in achieving their goal, what do the diplomatic staff rely on? How do they conduct their activities? And intelligence is one aspect of diplomacy, and how intelligently they employ the different means available to them. And the means are not always very legible, because if we look at the methods used, there is one extreme which is dialogue, second is negotiation, persuasion, compromise, and the other extreme, if these are on one side, dialogue, negotiation, persuasion and compromise, the other extreme is that you often also threaten to use force if things are not going your way or you're not able to realize your objective. So as a result of the methods used, the ends are realized. And what are the ends? The ends of any diplomatic activity is to create stability. So for example, if balance of power occurs, or alliances are formed, it is more importantly the role of diplomats who try and build these kind of alliances, or they want to bring these kind of balance, and it is their role and they are instrumental in creating these kind of new orders or new equations in world politics. Now, the second end of diplomacy is to create order and norms of behavior in international political arena. So what they do is, diplomats basically they set up benchmarks, or they set up standards against which the behaviors of different states can be tested. So for example, as we all know that international relations has one major shortcoming. The major shortcoming is that there is no central executing body, and this is a shortcoming of international law also. There is no centralized enforcing authority, and this is when norms and morality and reciprocity, all these processes come into play. So how in international politics a country is supposed to reciprocate the action of the other country, how it is supposed to conduct its relations or adhere to norms and morality, because these norms and moralities are not constitutionally dictated or they are not written in any law book. But what is important is that these have become accepted norms of behavior in international relations. So the essence of this point is that they try and create norms of behavior, what is expected behavior in international politics. Third end is to prevent conflict and from spilling over into a hot war. So if we look at this era after 1945, when United Nations had been formed, the world went through a very, very difficult phase, because Soviet Union, although it was on the victor side of the Allies, it wasn't happy with the treatment or the way the reparations from Germany was being distributed, because Russia's claim was that it had been affected most by the Second World War or by Germans' activity, so they should have more claim over Germany. So then this period of crisis, when the Allies, now they fall out with each other and Russia becomes a totally antagonistic pole, and the entire world gets divided into two poles, one led by the capitalist or the liberalist bloc known as the US, and the other was the communist bloc, which was led by the USSR. The problem with this period of Cold War was that Cold War was, you could not say it was a hot war, because A, there was no clear-cut loser or winner, and B, that there was no fixed date that a crisis started on this date and ended on this date. So because of this, we could not call this phase a hot war. Therefore, at least there was one achievement of diplomacy during the Cold War period, was that the crisis was managed, and most of the crisis could not end up in a full-fledged war. So the Third World War, which would have erupted with the Cuban Missile Crisis, was avoided because of the diplomatic activities of certain actors, and this is very important. Now, the fourth end of diplomatic activity is that this activity ends up in achieving the national interest. One important thing in politics is that in politics there are no permanent enemies, there are no permanent friends, only there are permanent interests. So a country will go all out to defend its national interest, and that is the most important thing. So diplomacy is all about trying to attain your national interest without having to compromise much. But of course, if it's a true diplomatic process, there are a certain give and take, and at times a little bit of compromise may be made, but by and large the national interest is attained. You don't majorly compromise on the national interest. Now, if we look at the role of diplomacy, there are certain basic roles of diplomacy. One is symbolic representation. That is, if the ambassador of US comes to India, we know that he is symbolically representing President Barack Obama. So Barack Obama may not possibly go to each and every country that he has relations with. So the ambassador to that country becomes the face of that particular government. The second important role of diplomacy is that it gives legal representation. So they are allowed by law to go and represent their country and negotiate on behalf of their country. This is called legal representation. And the third role of diplomacy is to provide political representation. So the political views, the notions, the aspirations of the government of a particular state is being conveyed to the other state. So these three roles of diplomacy are very important: symbolic, legal, and political representation. Now, if we look at how diplomacy is conducted, diplomacy is about interstate relations, how interstate relations are effectively conducted. Now, if you look at the levels of diplomacy, when I say levels, I mean how many actors are interacting. Then there are three kinds of diplomacy based on the levels that are being used. First is called bilateral diplomacy, which is primarily between two states, and there is one country which is sending the diplomatic representation and the other one is receiving. So there are only two countries, but of course this would differ if it was a case of mediation, or when United Nations provides the good offices. So the space is provided by United Nations, and the two differing or warring sides or conflicting sides, they go and negotiate in the good offices provided by the United Nations, or sometimes they go to a third place. For example, the Camp David was provided when the Arab-Israel conflict had broken out, because that was more relaxing to both the actors, because they don't feel comfortable enough in certain times to go into each other's territory. So the third place suits them more. Then if we look at the second level of diplomacy, is when more than two actors are involved, and this is called multilateral diplomacy, and these are mostly to do with regional or global issues, and there are a plurality of states and or international organizations interacting, and the forum is more international. So this is multilateral diplomacy, and with the evolution and technological development, this has become more important, except there are certain issues between two countries which cannot be solved multilaterally, so there are diplomatic activities which have to be undertaken. And if a diplomatic process does not fall between bilateral or multilateral, then we call it ad hoc diplomacy. So this involves other forms of diplomacy than the two aforementioned types of diplomacy. So ad hoc would be creative diplomacy, to suit the needs of the time. So at that time there's a particular requirement, and so for that then we start negotiating about on different planes. We may involve certain NGOs who can come and sit with us, or we may start look at some creative ideas or ways of negotiating. If we look at the norms, or what are the scientific or theoretical aspects of diplomacy, the first norm of diplomacy is the recognition in international political system is through establishing diplomatic relations. So we have to recognize the importance of establishing diplomatic relations, because as I told you in the UN Charter, one of the ways in which you try to isolate a country which is not behaving is through severing of diplomatic ties, and that is the first step towards conflict resolution, or you take actions against an erring country. And this is an important agenda, and that is that if you have established diplomatic relations, that means you are willing to negotiate. If you break off diplomatic relations, you are contemplating the next stage, and that could be use of force. So it becomes an important determinant in conflict resolution. The second is that if an embassy is established in another country, so the boundary wall of that embassy is considered to be representation or a microcosm of the parent country. For example, US Embassy in India, within the four walls of the US Embassy, the laws of the US, laws of United States of America would run, and not India. So it is a small replica or microcosm of United States of America, although physically it is located within India. And this is why there was a controversy during the Tiananmen Square crackdown, when the US Embassy had harbored a Chinese dissident in 1989, and the Chinese government couldn't do because they could not physically enter the US Embassy. Now, and the third important and very, very interesting norm of diplomacy is that diplomatic norms recognize that states have to spy on each other. And you know, many of the crises, the Vietnam War or the Cuban Missile Crisis, they erupted because the spy planes were shot down. So one country, for example, when the U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba, Cuba said that they were interfering or encroaching in their territory, but US was claiming this as a reason for launching attack on Cuba. So it is a spying mission. So what is the legitimacy of that spying mission? Therefore, the third norm here comes into play, that is they recognize that states, they have to spy on each other. Now, if we go to some of the legal aspects or laws of diplomacy, the important things are diplomatic recognition, that the accredited diplomats are the accredited agents of the government, and this accreditation have given them certain credentials, and this credential becomes important. The diplomats then are therefore accredited representatives of the state of their origin, and they have to be given certain concessions. These concessions are called diplomatic immunity. That is, there are certain restrictions, there are certain privileges that diplomats enjoy because we have to have them negotiating without any fear or favor. So the diplomats enjoy certain immunity or privileges. They are not subject to arrest by the local police. They have there are certain norms of behavior, there are certain rules laid down as to how they are supposed to be treated. Then the third important thing about diplomacy is the diplomatic immunity then also extends to these diplomatic pouch. These are packages sent between the embassy and its home country, and these pouches are not to be searched or frisked. So in the name of these diplomatic pouch, there have been episodes when there have been other things which have been sent across, but because these diplomatic pouch enjoy the immunity of not being searched, this opens a Pandora's box of questions and criticisms. And the other law of diplomacy is that every country which is recognized by the United Nations, every state which is recognized by the United Nations and is recognized by other nations must establish diplomatic relations with each other, unless of course when this relations become sour, they pull off their diplomatic institutions and their diplomatic personnel. But otherwise, the norms of international relations establishes that diplomatic relations have to be established between countries. Now, after discussing all this, the theoretical aspects, now let's look into some of the practical aspects. And if we look at the practical aspects, we have to look at the different types of diplomacy that we have. And the different types of diplomacy, basically, if we look at there are four broad kinds of diplomacy, and whatever I'm discussing next will fall in either of them, but they are not exclusive. So one diplomacy may be private, may be public, as well as be mixed, may be secretive, and it may be a new method. So it is not mutually exclusive categorization, there could be overlaps. Private or public means when private individuals are involved, it is a private diplomacy. When public figures or government officials or agents are involved, it is a public diplomacy. Private diplomacy, after the emergence of nation states, is being dissuaded because most of the time it is the government which needs to be represented, and it is the government which needs to do the negotiation. Therefore, diplomacy is by and large now public, except private economic interests need to be represented, and they can undergo that kind of diplomacy. Then the second type of diplomacy is pure diplomacy or mixed diplomacy. Pure versus mixed is, pure is when you use only theoretical, diplomatic or military mechanisms for achieving your diplomatic tools. That is, when you are negotiating, the kind of threat or force that you are going to use is your military force. That is called pure diplomacy. The moment you mix it up with economic sanctions, economic embargoes, breaking of diplomatic ties, calling back our ambassadors, rolling our embassies, these are called mixed techniques, and this is what is called mixed diplomacy. You are using more than one ingredient in your diplomatic procedure. The third kind of diplomacy is whether it is open or whether it is secretive. An open diplomacy is when the entire process is carried out open, in open arena. You can actually see the diplomats negotiating and talking, and the results of or the outcomes of the diplomatic negotiations are also public. The secret procedure, however, is when the confidentiality, strict confidentiality is maintained. The negotiations are carried on within four walls, nothing is leaked, and maybe the only thing that is leaked is after the negotiation has been carried out, the results or the outcomes of negotiations are made public. So no process is absolutely secret, because at the end of the day the diplomats go back to their country and they have to answer their people, and this is why we say that no procedure is fully open or fully secret, because even an open procedure at times for certain reasons, for certain purposes, have to be deliberated in secrecy. And then the most important differentiation between types is the traditional or new diplomacy. In traditional or new diplomacy, then we have a lot of subtypes. Traditional diplomacy is the typical diplomacy in which we had we would use only military force, we would use threat of we would use our weapons, our army advantage to negotiate, and there was, in most of the time, it was very, very bilateral and secretive. But the new diplomacy is divided into two eras. We have the Cold War diplomacy and the post-Cold War diplomacy. And the post-Cold War diplomacy, we have major negotiations or diplomatic activities being held on and around the issue of terrorism. Now, if you look at the parameters, how you divide a diplomatic process, and I'm going to describe in details only new and traditional diplomacy. So I'm going to look at three aspects, three parameters, while I'm trying to differentiate between traditional and new diplomacy. The first parameter is called structure. So we are going to look at the actors involved. The second is the process, how the method is organized, and the agenda is what are the issues or substances which have been taken up. So along these three parameters, then we try and divide diplomacy. So we look at traditional diplomacy. The structure is that it is a communication strictly between states, two or more states, and there are specialized institutions involved, embassies or resident missions, and we have professional diplomats. This hasn't changed much even in new diplomacy. Only the agenda has majorly changed. The agenda used to be bilateral in traditional diplomacy, and whatever they were discussing were issues were reflecting the personal ambitions of the ruler. For example, Henry Wotton, one of the diplomats of Queen Elizabeth, had gone on to say, he went to the extent of saying that the diplomats are those people who go and lie on behalf of the rulers. So he had that notion of diplomacy. Now, if you look at the process of traditional diplomacy, it is bilateral, very, very secretive, nothing leaks out, based on mutual agreement, for because the two countries have come together because of obviously the idea is to sort out the differences. And the 15th century onwards we started having diplomatic protocols. Diplomatic protocols means diplomatic immunity, diplomatic pouches, recognition of diplomat credentials, all these are come under the diplomatic protocols. Then we had started the concept of extraterritoriality, that it is the same which I have already discussed, that a building or the boundaries of a high commission in other countries are to be treated as part of the parent country of the embassy. And one important thing was, as I told you, that all political relations till by that time were confined majorly to Europe, and as a result this diplomatic procedure, which was traditional, was confined mostly to Europe. Then we graduated slowly to the new diplomatic techniques, and the structure remained similar, but there were new agents who were being added. Communication process in the traditional form was only between states, and here we have communication process between states and between states and non-state actors. So you had the involvement of more than states, you had the involvement of non-states, and the specialized institutions, embassies or resident missions and professional diplomats, they became more professional, more focused, and they were more they knew what their task was, they were trained for that. So these people were sort of trained to handle diplomatic procedures. They were career diplomats, they were trained thoroughly in the procedure. And the agenda, you see, there's a shift in agenda. The shift in agenda is from bilateralism to multilateralism or globalism, and they also take up certain issues which may not be specific to any two country or three countries, but these were issues which were in the largest interest of humankind, and there were newer areas which were emerging. So we were not talking about foreign relations or military threats, we were going beyond that. We were talking about humanitarian issues, we were talking about human rights, we were talking about epidemics, and we were talking about threats of terrorism. So new issues were being added to the traditional democratic process. Now if you look at the process evolved from being bilateral to multilateral. The deliberations could have been secretive, but the decisions are always open. The process is still based on mutual agreement for settling disputes. That is true for both. The diplomatic protocols is common to both the processes, new and traditional. Extraterritoriality still continues to remain, and the last process is different. Whereas traditional was confined to Europe, the process of negotiation in the newer diplomacy spreads to larger continents, it spreads to all the continents. And then in the broader type or typology of diplomacy, I would now like to quote some of the examples of diplomacy. What are the different diplomacy that have been so far conducted? So if we talk about personal diplomacy, this is the first type of diplomacy. You talk about one person who's going and carrying out the diplomatic activity. And Jimmy Carter for US used to be the one-man band who would be carrying out diplomatic activities in many of the countries, and he was effectively playing the role of a mediator. And till recently as South Sudan he was negotiating. Then you have another form of diplomacy which is called summit diplomacy, and as the name suggests, it is only the heads of state who are negotiating. An example of summit diplomacy is Parvez Musharraf and Atal Bihari Vajpayee's Agra summit. So the heads of the state, not their agents, but it is the heads who come together and they interact directly. This is called summit diplomacy. Then we have a new area which has emerged, and this is called e-diplomacy. E-diplomacy is also called digital diplomacy, and when you're using internet for conducting diplomacy, this is e-diplomacy. You know, the countries like UK and USA are the leaders in this kind of diplomacy, UK has a digital diplomacy department, whereas USA has, in its foreign office, it has an e-diplomacy office. So we have gone beyond physical exchange of diplomats, we are doing it on the virtual world. Then if you look at some of the Cold War diplomatic procedures, these are the important techniques which emerged. Preventive diplomacy. You know that every process is either curative or preventive. So Cold War, because we wanted a third war to be prevented from taking place, the most important reliance was on preventive diplomacy. Whenever there was a crisis, there would be efforts from all corners to prevent the crisis from escalating into a hot war, and this is known as preventive diplomacy. So if we are able to assess that a problem or a situation may escalate into a hot war, we have to undergo hurried negotiations so that the conflict is sorted out and that any kind of situation is alleviated. The next is called public diplomacy. When we use public opinion to solve problems or to handle crisis, this is called public diplomacy. One important example of public diplomacy is how US in Vietnam War had to retract. It had to retract because the public opinion in its own country had gone away from what its policies were, and they did not want US to intervene. So US had to backtrack and it had to pull out its forces from Vietnam. Then the other kind of diplomacy is called cookie diplomacy, a very important diplomatic technique used by Laura Bush in Afghanistan, and she would be distributing a cookie for some nominal price, and this is how she would win the hearts of Afghani people. Then we have another area which is called nuclear diplomacy. When we are trying to use or threaten to use atomic or nuclear weapons to achieve diplomatic goals, this is called nuclear diplomacy. So there are two aspects. One is to use this diplomacy when you already have a war or a crisis which has emerged and you try to mitigate the effects of that crisis. And the other is, the strategy is deterrence, when you make policies or you try to project that if a crisis escalates, these are the kind of drawbacks that are going to take place, and this is when the strategy of deterrence is used. The other kind of diplomacy most importantly used during the Cold War and during the Cuban Missile Crisis was the groupthink strategy. President Kennedy had decided that he would not communicate with Khrushchev, and all his communications were routed through this group, and this group was called the Executive Committee. It was a group of 14 to 16 members, and whatever decisions that were taken or whatever he had to communicate to Khrushchev was routed through this group. So in a way, this groupthink strategy was cushioning of the effects if they had direct confrontation. Then again in the Cold War period, we saw extensive use of gunboat diplomacy. And gunboat diplomacy is when a country uses its naval force to get an edge in conduct of foreign relations. And the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was instigated by United States and against Cuba, is an example of gunboat diplomacy. Now, if we look at other kinds of novel diplomatic techniques, sports diplomacy is also very important. For example, China opened up the possibility of rapprochement by inviting the US ping pong team, which was at that time in Japan. So they said that, why don't you visit China? And this in 1971, it was the first American team to be given official sanction to enter China. So this is known as sport, and we have several other instances of sports diplomacy. Then when culture is used for the benefit of nation in external relations, it is called cultural diplomacy. And we just develop a country's brand image and we try to sell that abroad. For example, India has been extensively using cultural diplomacy in all its international relations. Now, there's another aspect called parallel diplomacy, and this is very interesting because this is not like any other diplomacy. Here, there are efforts made by state institutions and the direction does not come from the Ministry of External Affairs. The direction, they just take up issues on their own. They try and negotiate or sort out issues at their own level without any directions from the foreign offices. And this is at times very handy, because if they are routed through the foreign office, it may take longer time, and there are certain emergency situations which need to be handled quickly. So this parallel diplomacy is quite helpful between states. Now, having said this, I would now effectively like to conclude my lecture by saying that there are two kinds of diplomatic techniques which are available. One is a friendly diplomacy as a friendly tool, and the other extreme is when you are using diplomacy as a coercive tool. Coercive tool is when you use or threaten to use force for attaining your national interest or certain policy objectives. So long as the process is friendly, the outcome can be of two extremes. The outcome is either you are able to solve the problem, or you are not able to solve the problem, because the other side takes you very lightly, because they say that this is a friendly country and in any eventuality they are not going to use force. Same applies with coercive diplomacy. You threaten to use force, the other country starts assessments. They just follow you, or they obey you only because the risk of disobeying is higher. That is why they obey you. There is no objective that I want to sort this problem, but the objective is that what if I do not hear or listen to them, they may use force. So the price that they have to pay for disregarding is higher, and that is why they obey. And the other extreme is that they counter by saying that if you use force, I am going to reciprocate, and then it's a complete chaos, breakdown of entire procedure. So there are certain important criteria. Diplomatic procedures, you have to have them secretive at times and open at the other times. You have to use diplomacy as important tool of alternative dispute resolution mechanism, because we do not need another world war. We do not need, there are already too many wars. We need conflict resolution. And what is the best way of attaining conflict resolution? The best technique available is diplomacy. So with this, I would just like to conclude, and I may carry forward this discussion in some of the other lectures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the very well structured lecture, in fact a very lucid lecture, and I would just like to wind up also with a question. Say, what is economic diplomacy?
Oh yes, when you use your economic advantage to gain your policy objectives in international relations, that is called economic diplomacy.
Right.
So the big five have been doing it. Now we have the G20, which has an economic advantage. So when they use their economic leverage to negotiate in diplomatic terms, it is economic diplomacy.
Thank you for explaining, ma'am. And with this, I'd like to wrap up the lecture. And first of all, thank you for being here, sparing your valuable time, and the viewers for watching. So as ma'am said, she would be continuing this discussion in another lecture of hers. So I request you all to stay tuned in and watch out for this. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.